Okay, then let's just start for now. I'm sure that more participants will trickle in over the next minutes. And we will just start with Xavier and Martin, and I hope that Kai will still come online in a little bit. So welcome everyone to this webinar on the science policy interface around natural assets. I will quickly introduce myself. My name is Hanna Mörsberger. I work as a science officer for Future Earth. And within that, I coordinate our knowledge action network on natural assets, and I lead our activities for all kinds of early career initiatives. So this is a really nice combination of my two work areas, this webinar. And we're here as this webinar is a part of a series of 5 webinars on how to better translate science into policy. The first 3 webinars covered the topics of urban and cities, of oceans, and the food, water, energy nexus. This webinar is on natural assets, and the next one will be on sustainable consumption and production. So these are 4 of the topic of Future Earth's knowledge action networks. The webinars are organized by the Early Career Researchers Network of Networks, the Young Scholars Initiatives of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and Future Earth. And I will give you a quick overview of how we intend to structure the webinars. We will start off with brief presentations by our speakers. And then we will have a small roundtable discussion where we have prepared a few questions for the speakers. And afterwards, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. So you will all have the chance to ask the questions that you're really interested in. I would encourage you, if you have questions, to just type them in the chat box. You see the chat box on the right side of the window, and you can just send your questions to everyone. And then we will make sure we address them in the webinar later. If we have enough time, it would also be great to actually really open a dialogue, and so that you can ask your questions in person. So we will see how it goes with time, if we can accommodate that. And the webinar will be recorded, so we will publish the recording online, so you will be able to share that with your colleagues or relevant networks, because of course we're aware that we can't accommodate all the different time zones. We got quite a few emails of people who are interested but couldn't join because it's in the middle of the night. So we will put them on our website so that they're accessible by everyone at any time. All right, so let me start off by introducing our 2 speakers. We have Martin Winter with us. Martin is the scientific coordinator of the Synthesis Center of the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, IDIB. He describes himself, and I would like to use this as a quote, as a wildlife ecologist in macroecologist's clothing with a species invasion cap and a macroevolutionary hanky, who worked over the last years also with plants. So I think maybe we need a bit more of explanation on that later. Last year, for example, Martin gave a TED talk titled "Aliens Are Everywhere" on the global movement of invasive alien species. And his job at the Synthesis Center got him more and more interested in measuring the actual impact of research, including how early career researchers can become more visible and play a key role in the science policy arena. So we're really happy to have you here, Martin. As a second speaker, we have Xavier Leroux. Xavier is a senior scientist at the French National Institute for Agricultural Research, and he's also the chair and the CEO of the AeroNet Biodiversa, which is a network of national and regional organizations programming, and funding research on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And one of the key foci of Biodiversa is to support the interface of science society and of science policy during the whole research process, and increasing the impact of research results. Xavier has a background in ecosystem ecology and microbial ecology, and he's been a lead author of the recent IPBES assessment, so that's the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, their assessment for Europe and Central Asia. He's also a member of the French delegation to the CBD conferences, the Convention for Biological Diversity, and he is the scientific leader of the national scientific expertise required by the French Ministries of Environment and Agriculture. So I would now invite Martin maybe to start off by briefly introducing your work at the Synthesis Center, your various roles between science and policy, and maybe what got you interested in trying to measure research impact a bit more.
Yes, thanks, Hannah. Okay, let me start. So my role here at the center is, so the Synthesis Center, STIF, is part of a larger research center, which has at the moment roughly 200 employees, and I guess 130 or something scientists. It's in Leipzig in Germany. Leipzig is roughly 1.5 hours south of Berlin. So it's a research center funded by our research foundation, so something like the NSF in the US. And it's a non-permanent research center. And we are in the middle of our possible life, which is maximum 12 years. So just a setting. And I'm leading here a center, the Synthesis Center. We're doing similar things than other synthesis centers. We invite working groups after they had to go through a normal call and the review process. And these working groups usually have 20 people, 15 to 20 people, and meet here over several meetings over several years. And I also lead a group of, at the moment, 10, 12 researchers, sabbaticals and postdocs, and have an admin team. And what got me in, so what my role here is to supervise the science in the Synthesis Center. It means I'm coordinating more or less with my administrative team the calls, and also the review procedure, these kind of things. Basically, partly what an editor of a journal is doing, and much more because I also try to help the people writing the proposals. And I mentor and partly supervise all the postdocs here. And since we are part of a larger research center, like a professor lab in a university, I also I'm part of the governance of the whole research center. So I'm doing this since 6 years, and I started as scientist, as Hannah mentioned the description from one of my websites. I'm a macroecologist and an invasion ecologist, and I also worked for the IPCC before I started this job here, and I'm also author for IPBES and many other things. So I'm sitting as scientist here in front of you. So I'm still writing papers when I have time, which is very rarely. I'm collaborating a lot with other scientists, but I'm also sitting as administrator here. So I'm working very closely with the administration of the university, and I'm an administrator. So I'm also dealing with issues like reimbursement guidelines, these kind of things. So I'm doing both. I would say at the moment, it depends what is on my table. At the moment, we have the call, which comes next week, which is online, and we have also a call. I'm actually collaborating very strongly right now with Xavier, with the ERANET Biodiversa he's leading, together with other synthesis centers. So this is on my table. I would say 80-20%. So 80% at the moment leading the synthesis center, and maybe 20% science. Sometimes I'm a week in a working group, my own or somewhere else, then it's of course more science, but usually it's like this. What brought me into research impact? Of course, because we had since 6 years, 80 meetings, 80 working groups meetings, 80 plus, and over almost 60 working groups being here with different topics, biodiversity related topics, from microbial diversity to deep sea species communities, very theoretically based ecosystem service approaches, to other more applied working groups for alien species or phylogenetic diversity and conservation, all kinds of topics. And what me as the leader and as one who drives that with I have also an advisory board. Of course, we are interested in what is the impact of those groups. Is it only a very expensive, or maybe not expensive, way of fostering science, of bringing people together, who usually don't have the money to travel and bring a group of 15 experts together? Of course, we are interested that this also matters to science, first of all. So our funding agency is really interested in supporting science, also basic science. We don't necessarily have to be applied, and we also don't necessarily have to be interdisciplinary. So that's the mission of the funding agency. But of course, we also have groups who are very strongly interdisciplinary or very strongly tackle an applied topic. And that's the question. So after 6 years, what makes a success of a working group? How can this be supported more than what I'm doing already, what my team and what the people are doing already? How can we maybe the success of a working group quantified, which is basically almost not possible, but also in terms of brought into a story. So what makes a team of scientists coming from all over the place a successful research collaboration? And that is an inherent question, because we fund those groups. So we have to think about how can we give them as environment to be able to do successful science. But also for me as scientist, at least in the last years, I deliberately choose this job because I wanted to leave this hamster wheel, as I call it, which some of you might still in there, where you have to publish a paper every now and then, usually more now than then. And then you are lucky if 30 people read this paper, and these are the same 30 people you cited. So it's basically this circus of the same people we are dealing with, and it's hard to see how you can escape this circus and make it to the next step, having an impact to the real life. So let's say I wrote a paper about phylogenetic and diversity and conservation, and how much can I foster this kind of paper that conservation managers and decision makers take up the ideas, if they're good or bad, it's a different question, to come up with ideas and decisions and really legislative frameworks to conserve maybe evolutionary distinct species. So not only writing a paper in a nice journal, be it Science or Nature or whatever, but beyond that. And that's something which is, for me personally, very important, because I think science, for me, I see myself as a scientist, that this is the one why I'm doing science. I'm not necessarily a basic scientist anymore, maybe. And I also need to think about that, because we fund so many groups. We have lots of money per year, which we spend in fostering collaborations, and we want to see how this is really makes an impact. And why I'm interested in that, and I can tell you there's no answer. I don't have a formula in the back of me, or I can send you a paper where everything is written, how you measure impact, or how you can foster a group that it gets successful. There are many ways of that, and I will talk about this. I also worked, as I said, for the IPCC and for IPBES, still author, and also stepped back as being in LA, whatever. And after seeing how these kind of reports are perceived and used in the world, and we all know what's going on right now, and that's another issue where I started to think about a lot. How can you make sure that the science you put a lot of time and efforts in, and we know we work a lot over weekends, although this is not always necessary, how can we make sure, or how can we work on that this kind of work is taken up and is used by those who make decisions, and used by those who need those evidences to make decisions? That's a different question. And what we do here in our center, just going next step, so how do we do this science policy interface? Very roughly, so we are, as I said, a center of 200 people here, not only the synthesis center, but we also have 9 professors of all kinds of biodiversity related topics. And we have a science policy committee in our center. I'm part of that. And we meet regularly and discuss with scientists from our center, but also with politicians from local to German-wide, but also international, like IUCN or whatever committees or bodies, to ask them what do you need at the moment from scientists, and then we see what of those topics we can maybe support. Which of those topics we don't do everything, of course, but some of the topics we are more stronger than in others, and we also offer our topics more actively to see if they are used or needed in some ways. For example, in Germany at the moment, I think it's the same at international level. We are talking about biodiversity strategies post 2020, and this is certainly something where biodiversity research is very much needed, and we offer our expertise to support this process to come up with let's say robust and more evidence-based strategies. And as the scientists in our center itself are authors in all kinds of more science-related bodies like IPBES, so we have many IPBES authors in our centers, or the GBO, Global Biodiversity Outlook, and we're also hosting the Secretariat of GeoBonn, which is a more monitoring biodiversity related international body. So there are people here leading this initiative and coordinating this initiative. So there are a couple of things ongoing from all kinds of spatial scales where people in IDIF, the center itself is the name IDIF, are involved. And I'm part of that. I'm involved in some of those. I'm also author in some of those. And what we also do, since we are in Germany, our center is in Saxony, it's one of the federal states here in Germany, we are also doing what usually other scientists everywhere in the world are doing. We are advising governments. I was in a governmental hearing several times for topics I'm an expert in, and other authors doing this. So this is the rough setting, I would say. Should I talk more? But I think that was 7 minutes probably already.
Yeah, it was, and thanks a lot. That was a really good introduction to your different roles and activities, and probably already gave us quite a bit to think about. And for those of you who just arrived, I said before that if you have questions along the way, to one of the speakers, feel free to type them in the chat box on the right side of your Zoom window. And we will make sure we address them during the last 20 minutes of the call when we open it up. And then now I would like to invite Xavier to briefly introduce your work at the Biodiversity AreaNet, but of course also your other activities in the science policy interface. Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting me. If you can, the PPT.
Yes, sorry. You're right.
I'm old-fashioned. I'm not like Martin. I need a PPT, you know.
So you should be able to see it.
Yeah, it's not the first one. Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot. Okay, so thanks to you and Futures for inviting me to this webinar. And so offering me the opportunity, well, not too much to present biodiversity. I will be quick on 5 slides, but then mainly illustrating and presenting the way we try to promote the integration of science and policy through the whole research process. So next slide. So a few words on biodiversity, which is the network in Europe. I should say the European network of research programmers and funders promoting the ERA for biodiversity and ecosystem services. ERA, it's European Research Area. Next slide. So who we are, actually, we are a set of agencies, ministries that program and fund research on biodiversity, and NBS, it's nature-based solutions. You see the number of countries, 33 so far, 35 agencies and ministries. You have the geographical distribution of these. including overseas territories linked to Europe. And we also, during the last years, we have engaged more and more with non-European partners. Next slide. And of course, yeah, a stronger EC link. Our activities, I will not detail, but keep in mind that sometimes a network like Vice Versa may be perceived as mainly launching calls and funding research, which is true. But it's only one of the 6 main activities we have. You see, we have development of strategic research agenda. We have a range of activities, including synthesis. Martin was saying this, and we are doing this in collaboration with synthesis centers. Knowledge brokerage dissemination, stakeholder engagement, mapping, foresight activities, etc. So I will not detail this. Today I will focus on science policy interfacing. Next slide. Only to say that the overall domain and the overall challenges we try to tackle are very close, I would say, to well, the philosophy of the natural asset can of Future Earth. You have here a slide indicating how we more and more recognize the lack of sustainability of many traditional approaches by humans regarding natural resources. And we promote other approaches, so it's maybe conservation up to the development of nature-based solutions, trying to reinforce the sustainability of these activities. Okay, and the status of biodiversity. And last slide for biodiversa presentation, it's research funding still, it's important for some of you, maybe. So you have a few figures here. 7 calls launched, actually we have just launched number 8. You can see that maybe from time to time with some joint programming initiatives. The Commission, European Commission, actually it's 2 with the European Commission, and even with the Belmont Forum, as you can see, close to 180 million, which becomes to be substantial for the domain. Okay, so let's jump more now into what we are here for. Next slide. That is the way we see, we try to promote science society, science policy interfacing, and policy stakeholder engagement through the whole research process in Vice Versa. By the way, it's not natural to see, you see at the bottom of the slide, that since 2015, Vice Versa has hired a science society policy officer that is in charge of promoting this kind of interfacing, which it's quite important because there are 3 full-time people for Vice Versa, 1 devoted to this. So it's, I think, a clear criterion here. Okay, so next slide. First thing, we have to be clear on where we are as Vice Versa in the policy landscape. Actually, for Vice Versa, we may tend to, on the right, to see us as mainly engaging with European policies, European policy making bodies, which is the case. We have a range of DGs, in particular DG Research and DGR, but also importantly DG Agri, DG Climate, etc. But we are actually also developing strong links at the international level, in particular IP-based, but also CBD, etc. And very importantly, national and national policymakers. I will explain a bit more later. And so the first difficulty, I would say, would be to integrate these different levels. And maybe a main message here is that scientists, we actually, we see that scientists can relatively easily engage with local national policymakers in their research projects, for instance, because they have links very often to these guys, whereas it's much more difficult at the European level and international level. Okay, next slide. And so the overall approach we have to promote this interface, science policy interface, and actually it's more general. It's the same approach for science policy interface, science society interface. You see here the way to see this with, well, it's a scheme, but 3 main phases. The first one is co-development of research. Co-development means, okay, what is your overall strategy, your overall priorities, the kind of research you want to support. When you say the kind of research, it's the topics, of course, but it's really the nature of the research. And at the end, it will be translated in the very cold text you will publish, for instance. And at the end, the kind of research you will fund. And here, for co-development, we have already a range of things promoting the interface by involving policy stakeholders into, for instance, the Vice Versa Advisory Board. We have a member of the European Parliament, for instance. We have a representative, the head of the biodiversity unit of DG Env. We have also a representative of DG Research, etc. At this level. So we already have this. And we also have, for instance, boundary organizations also with a role for policymaking like ICN, etc. And more generally speaking, we co-develop, for instance, our research and innovation agenda with stakeholders, including policymakers. So next slide. It's a scheme indicating this. Either formally we have some of these policy stakeholders strongly linked to Vice Versa through, for instance, the advisory board, or through the links we have, because we have regular meetings with some of them in Brussels, etc. Or more from time to time, we may mobilize other policy stakeholders, for instance, when we develop or update the strategic agenda of Vice Versa. So this means that at the very beginning here, we do have their view. It may be their expectation, it may be knowledge needs. There is a round of things that these stakeholders can bring in when you shape your own agenda. Next slide. Then we can move to the second step, which is co-production with stakeholder engagement in research projects. So I say step, of course, you understand that it's actually everything is at the same time, but I have to find one way or the other to present it to you. So for the co-production with policy stakeholder engagement, as Vice Versa, we had very early to shape the kind of call we launch and the kind of evaluation process we use and criteria we use to evaluate proposals. You have to, for instance, to know that we have academic excellence as a main criterion, but we also have relevance for society and policy, and stakeholder engagement, including policy stakeholder engagement, as an evaluation criterion. So it's quite obvious what we expect in terms of kind of research. We, at the same time, recognize it's very challenging for scientists to do this. I consider that probably 90% of them, they don't know how to do this. Maybe half of them, they don't have the minimum knowledge to even imagine what it could be. Why? Because they have never been trained to this, or they have been trained in other schemes, programs to do something completely different, that is purely academic excellence, and that's all. And I would even push and be provocative by saying that in many spheres, there is a thought to think that there may be a trade-off between academic excellence and engagement with stakeholders and policymakers. So it's a challenge, and we recognize this, and we have developed actually tools to help researchers to do this. Tools, but also matchmaking events, etc. So we can move on this co-production aspect. For me, it's a very important message, this. That is, you cannot ask this kind of thing to scientists without helping them, without shaping the programs in an acceptable way. And sometimes my feeling is that you may ask too much to scientists. So if you do not provide tools so that they can reach this goal, it may be challenging. So next slide. In 2014, for instance, we have published the Biodiversity Stakeholder Engagement Handbook. So it's general stakeholder, but it includes policy stakeholders, to explain what is stakeholder engagement in research projects, why you would like to do this, how you can do this, who can be the stakeholders to engage, etc. And then, you see, it was 4 years ago, and our analysis was, we have observed a very clear increase in the quality of stakeholder engagement in biodiversity proposals, except for policy stakeholders. It is a science policy interfacing. It's much more difficult for a range of scientists. So that's why we have just published, well, we will publish in early November maybe, this guide on policy relevance of research and policy stakeholder engagement in research proposals. So it's brand new. And next slide. To have, so you are the first to see this, maybe it's among the first. So you see in this guide you have a basis that is to understand why a program like Biodiversity promotes and evaluates policy relevance and science policy interfacing in research proposals. So it's not stakeholders, it's really policy stakeholders. Second, we have a part in four parts, you see, the sieve approach, to state the policy relevant, to identify the policy stakeholders you want to engage, the engagement, the way to engage with these policy stakeholders, and then to value the added value you have to engage, in particular at the European and international level. And the last part, it's do's and don'ts, that is very concrete example from biodiversity proposals to exemplify the way to do this. It's really to help scientists to do this for research proposals. It's mainly for research proposals what we present here. Okay, next slide. This last aspect, it's promoting research impact, at least knowledge transfer, knowledge brokerage. So we do this by policy brief production, analysis of project outputs. I will not say much about this, but it's quite important. It's a posteriori to see what's happening. And also a specific activity, more important, it's the link with IPBES. So next slide, concerning this. First aspect, production of policy brief. We have published, I think, 10 policy briefs. So it's really to recognize that we may bring additional resources sometimes when needed, and skills, by mobilizing and paying professional knowledge brokers to allow funded projects, funded by Biodiversity. We put an additional amount of money to help them to produce policy briefs. Some of them they don't need, they already plan and they have the skills within their consortium, that's fine. Sometimes it's not the case and we may help them then. Okay, next slide. Last slide for this. It's the example of the way we interact with IPBES. Two aspects. One, it's more linked to capacity building, that is to take into account the outputs from IPBES concerning capacity building, and to take this into account into biodiversity programs. And on the right, you have more the knowledge gaps identified by IPBES through assessments, etc. That are taken into account in biodiversity program. One example for the right aspect, it's the Belmont Forum biodiversity calls on biodiversity scenarios, for instance, where we have taken into account what was produced by IPBES, the topical, well, it was a methodological assessment for scenarios. It was taken into account. And now we have a strong interaction with IPBES also to prepare the best uptake of the results that will be obtained by these funded projects by IPBES. Okay, next slide. I think it's over. Well, nearly. It's a conclusion, I guess. Yeah. So you see, the way we see this in Biodiversa, we support approaches that reinforce the consistency, efficiency, and long-term view for programming and funding research on biodiversity. And we promote stakeholder and policy stakeholder engagement from inception and through the whole research development process. That is, for us, it's not a linear model where we just wait for having the results and we hope one way or the other to help these results to be used by policymakers. We really try an integration through the whole research process and to reach this goal, this systemic approach of science policy interfacing, we have early recognized the need to rethink actually the whole process actually, or part of process quite deeply, using innovation procedures, tools, etc. So the kind of call we launch, the evaluation criteria, the tool we use to support the research community, etc. It's innovative, but it's needed if we want things to be changed and a more integrative approach. And to do this, it has to be done on the long term, clearly. So next and last slide. You see that we think that for us, science policy interfacing, it's really on the long term, systemic, which is an overdue liaison, we think, if we want to be successful in better promoting or demonstrating at the end the added value of research for policymaking. I have indicated the name of Frederic, you see here. The address is the officer in charge of Science Society Policy Interfacing. So if you want to contact him, you can. Of course, you can contact me also, but there is somebody devoted. Yeah. Okay.
Great. Sorry. Thank you a lot, Xavier, for the overview and also for sharing some insights of your many years of work experience in Biodiversa and in coordinating these different calls and synthesizing their outcomes. That's very, very interesting. Sorry, I will just quickly switch back to perfect. So we've now heard the two introductions by our speakers. I have a few questions that I will ask them now, but as I said before, if you have any questions yourself, please feel free to type them in the chat box, or you can also, if you would like to make a comment or speak up, you can just type an exclamation mark in the chat box so that we know you have a comment or a question and you would like to take the floor. So I think I have one question which can probably be asked to both of you, since both your institutes work with coordinating calls and also synthesis of knowledge and of research results. But I will start with Martin as the first speaker. So I was curious whether you said you're trying to measure, of course, the impact and the success of your working groups, of the research projects, or the synthesis projects. To what extent is this measuring the impact and measuring the success, is this connected to policymaking? To what extent do you see an influence by or an influence of policymaking as a success of your working groups?
That's a good question. So, of course, it's very simple to measure the success scientific-wise in terms of number of papers, number of citations, or any tools many institutions use, like Altmetric or Impact Story, to see how widely how visible results were. So that is something we use. I also use the DFG, so our funding agency, doesn't ask for these kind of things. Of course, they want to see that we publish papers, but that's basically all. They're not necessary. They also want to see that the journals are visible. And we had now in Germany also the discussion about some of the predatory journals. So they want to see that we publish properly, but that's all. So beyond that, we also check a bit how visible these kind of things were. And internally, we try to see if, for example, working groups with a postdoc or without a postdoc, or with 2 or 3, or whatever kind of setting in terms of meetings is more successful in terms of outputs. But beyond that, it's actually more storytelling. So how do I know that an output of a working group what is used in a policy relevant arena for decision making or for advising? How do I know that evidence is produced by one of our funded working groups or postdocs is used for a policy relevant in a policy relevant arena? That's actually something we did not find a way to quantitatively measure, and I have several meetings with other institutes like ours, other synthesis centers over the years, and they also don't have a simple formula to measure that. What it is usually storytelling. So we also support, similar to what Xavier says, in a probably much lower frequency, working groups to produce policy briefs. At least we offer that. Usually the groups come with their own experts, and many of our groups are really not directly policy relevant. But if they are, we try to follow the path of the outputs, usually as peer-reviewed publications. And that's not simple. And it comes either by randomly that groups come back to us and saying, look, Martin, here we have this paper, or and this was taken up by a big newspaper, and then it was taken up because some of the authors was called by government or any other policy body. So these are usually stories let's say, randomly, and then used for showing that some of these groups or outputs are really meaningful to policy. But again, at least ESTIF, so the center I'm leading, is not necessarily everything is towards policy relevance, different to, for example, CSync, another synthesis center in the US, which is really very much applied and looking into socio-environmental problems, which are more directly linked to policy relevant topics. So we have a couple of groups which tackled relevant topics in this arena: ecosystem services, alien species, and some of them, for example, the alien species group, which is also a group I was part of, their results even made it into EU policy. So for that, we know, because we are part of that, and we could, I would say by chance, track those results. But it's really hard to find out that, let's say, I'm just making it up. Andrea works in the center I'm also working. She's right now listening. That Andrea's paper was taken up by the German government or by the EU. How should you know that? That's really hard, because politicians never cite our papers, but they have lots of middlemen, other agencies who support them with evidences. And that's why we're trying to work with a science policy committee and trying to get more closer contact to politicians to have a direct path bringing our evidences to those people. But actually, it's not simple. It's storytelling. It's nothing I can measure with a formula, not even with R. Even R can almost do everything. It's asking the authors every now and then what we do. Did you heard something? Did you heard that your papers were taken up by maybe your government, maybe by any other body like CBD or whatever? And beside this, if there is a policy brief, of course, you can see how you distribute that, but it's not easy. And we also try to push, if possible, and that's really hard because in our case, it's a different language, try to push people publishing in, if it's relevant for Germany, also in the German language. And that's, of course, not on the agenda of many international scientists.
Okay, great. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
On this?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
So in Biodiversa, we do the same. That is, we have to evaluate the outcome. You have seen my presentation. If you do this, of course, you have to evaluate the outcome to know if it's working or not. At the same time, we have also realized quite early that maybe dangerous to, strictly speaking, evaluate researchers and research consortia based on their impact, strictly speaking, impact on policy making, etc. Why? Because, well, you are not naive. You know that there are many reasons for policymakers even to ignore, possibly, the facts you will bring to them. I'm not telling that they are doing this all the time, not at all. But they are, when you know a bit the machinery of policy making, it's quite complex, and yeah, it's there are many reasons. It can be timing. It can be it's you are not adjusted to the policy agenda, or yeah, there are many reasons for which even if you are very successful, even in translating and disseminating your results, and they are perfectly adequate for policy making, it will not be taken up. So we refuse, actually, to evaluate things based on impact. We do not refuse success stories, as said by Martin. I think it's when it happens, it's good to know. But we cannot, for instance, evaluate that finally the outcome of a research project is not good because they have not changed the policy. Right, a policy. So on the reverse, we evaluate the outcome, not only academic outcome. I invite you to have a look at the brochure we have published on the outcome of 2008 called projects, for instance, and for the program as a whole. But then for each project, we have developed a range of criteria, maybe, to evaluate the outcome, academic outcome, and products, stakeholder relevant products, I would say, including for policy stakeholders. Very diverse, as said by Martin, so it's very challenging. This means that you have to spend time to discuss with the researchers, to ask them who are your stakeholders, who do you know the kind of outcome you may have had. You may have to discuss with stakeholders also to do so. So it's a long, yeah, quite important investment. Interesting, you will see that we have also in this brochure evaluate the relationship between academic excellence, that is criteria more easy to evaluate for academic excellence, versus the range of criteria we had for stakeholder engagement, etc. And the good news is that we did not find the classical trade-off expected between these. That is, you can have an excellent project from an academic perspective that has excellently engaged with stakeholders, policy stakeholders, etc. It's so it's positive. Okay.
Thank you very much. I see that we have a question in the chat box. I was wondering, Vincent, whether you would like to take the floor and just briefly read it out and ask the question yourself, if you're comfortable. If not, I can also read it out.
Yes, Hannah, thank you. No problem. So my question was, so as the international community is starting to look at the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and so what is going to replace the Aichi targets, so according to you, what are the biggest challenges for the scientific community in designing those new targets or something else than targets? And how are you institutes planning to play a role in that process? And is it for you an area where you feel like you can have a big impact, since we're talking about impact at the science policy interface, or do you feel like there's other areas where you think it's more important to focus? So that's my question. Thank you.
Who first? Okay, yeah, that's actually, it's actually a very good question. So I already mentioned that we are, at least at the German level, this is ongoing. So first of all, I think it's quite late at the moment to to jump on that, not quite late. But this train is already driving, and the discussion, I mean, of course, started already a while ago. So in IDEF, so not only the synthesis center, but the whole research center, we would like to play a role, but not because we like to be on more meetings, but we think some of the research in our center is relevant and can support this process with evidences for one or the other question. That's first of all, so this is, I would say, the inherent motivation to play a role there. But as I said, not all of the research we are doing here is relevant for, not directly for post-2020. How we do try to do this, so we had quite intense discussions at which level, spatial level, the researchers in IDEF want to play a role. And in our specific case, so in IDEF, is because we fight for a sustainability plan after the funding of our center is running over and the money is not coming from the EU, nor will it come from CBD, whatever. We focus on this spatial level where the money comes from. So we try to be relevant for those hierarchies and spatial levels, which will hopefully fund the whole center. So this is Germany, these are the federal states. So where we try to play a role is at the discussion of post-2020 biodiversity strategies for Germany, as well as for the federal states. Everything more international is at the moment, and this is really in the flow. We have a science policy committee, which is also now rebuilding a kind of, is probably based a bit on individual involvements like IPBES or people who are researcher here, we might by coincidence involved in IUCN or CBD discussions, and there are several. And I think just generally the challenge for me usually is to find out how to be part of that and whom to contact to offer help and support. And this is for me more challenging. So what should I do now? I mean, I know a lot of people. I could write an email to, I don't know, I would have to check who is in the IT target committee, SIPSTAR meetings, these kind of level usually, and ask them, how can I support you with the evidences I have? So there are several organizations and levels through which those kind of scientific evidences are channeled to support these discussions. And I think the most challenging part is as scientists to see where you can enter this kind of discussions and channels if you want that. So this is really time consuming. Or how you could offer your evidences, your research, if you think they're relevant, to whom you could offer them, that they are taken up and support those discussions. I think this is quite challenging. And as researcher itself, you should just make for yourself probably an internal, so in discussion with yourself or with your colleagues, at which level, spatial level, you want to play a role. Is it the country you are working for? Is it the institute you are working for? Is it internationally? And also time-wise, don't underestimate the time you spend in any of those kind of things. So it all sounds super nice that you can go to Buenos Aires to an IPBES meeting, but in general, it's a week full of super intense meetings with several weeks of tasks on top, unpaid on your job. So it's also in discussion you have to think about you want to do that. And I find challenging to know how to enter this kind of process.
Briefly, I would say first for biodiversity, the key question is the added value we would have. That is, our objective is not to be everywhere on all the fronts due to resources, as said by Martin, also legitimacy. So here, what we are talking about, it's really developing a biodiversity policy agenda mainly. And so biodiversity could act, I would say, case by case, if we are mobilized or asked to mobilize scientists, etc. This is the kind of thing we can do. Maybe on some particular segments of this kind of action, we may have a role, but only on particular segments, I think. On the reverse, I think that the kind of body we are, we may have a role upstream, that is all the research promoted by biodiversity may help the scientists to produce important things to help them to be ready to engage in this kind of process. A good example for the research community is, for instance, the development of these essential biodiversity variables, things like this, which are highly needed if you want to be prepared. But I will conclude to say that for biodiversity, listening to this, I was thinking that it may be the most important, maybe to prepare the research community to promote its capacity, for instance, to survey, to evaluate policies, past policies, but also new ones. We think too much about sometimes, we think too much about, well, either understanding biodiversity dynamics, etc., or investing into policy making, but we have to be sure that we invest sufficient resources and help sufficiently the research community to evaluate the policies taken, the regulations, directives for European level, etc. And sometimes we realize when we have a fitness check or something like this that we may have invested a bit more, allowing the researchers to do this job. Okay.
Thanks a lot. That was very interesting to hear. I would like to conclude, seeing that we have about 2 minutes left, keeping in mind that this is a series of webinars that is organized by early careers and for early careers. So naturally, I think it would be very interesting for many people in our audience to hear. You mentioned some of the difficulties of translating science into policies. And for example, Xavier, you mentioned that in your experience, the majority of scientists still lack the skills actually, or the knowledge on co-production and co-design of research, that it's difficult to engage policymakers in your research process, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering, do you have recommendations for early career researchers and also early career professionals as to what they, as the next generation, can maybe do better, where we can help improve, and how to just, where maybe you see key points where particularly younger researchers can engage or can like hook into the process.
As a joke, read the Biodiversity Stakeholder Engagement Handbook and the Policy Guide first. But it's not only a joke. It is read some stuff like this. There are other things. But if you're interested in this, you have to recognize that you have to invest a bit to learn about this. Second, be also clear about, as a scientist, the way, to what extent you want to engage in this direction. Maybe I invite you then to read something else. It's the book by Pilke called The Honest Broker, I think. And I think that, if I remember, Pilke is really clear on the fact that there is no one way to do this. You as a scientist, you may decide that you are not interested, for instance, in engaging with policymakers, policy arena, and that's fine. That's fine. You can do your research in your lab and have fun and have a great professional life like this. Others will do will use other approaches. I like very much personally the honest broker of policy options. That is, my view is that indeed, when you engage with the policy arena, you may decide to promote your research results one way or the other to lobby. It's one approach. That is to convince policymakers, for instance, that they absolutely need to do some things. And that's fine. You can do this indeed. And there is this honest broker of policy options. That is, you see the scientists, the research world, as presenting options, and maybe not only presenting, but unfolding new options. That is, the politician not realizing initially that there may be other options than the ones they see generally. And the research world is credible in maybe its capacity to propose new approaches and new options. And then it's very personal. What I say, it's the view of other actors maybe to decide on policy making. But yeah, read Pilke and find your own way in this jungle, and then learn accordingly.
Thanks a lot. Martin, do you maybe want to add something?
I don't know. I mean, Xavier said everything. I personally learned from doing some of this work. I supported as scientist the IPCC, and I learned a lot, and I could see how scientists work, how much work it is, and also how the process behind the curtain administrative wise works, and how the links to the people working which take up IPCC. So there are several fellowship programs if you feel you have the time, or if they are paid. If this is a job you would like to, you can also choose this as a time of looking into these kind of processes. And there are several, like also for Future Earth, like you work for, Hannah, jobs where people can learn from these processes and maybe then find out that's something for me or that's something not for me. And if it's 1 or 2 years, it should not be too long to destroy careers. So I think if people are really interested, there are possibilities to get paid for, or at least to spend some of the time supporting some of these initiatives and really learn from that and not only read. That's what I can say, and it helped a lot myself, and I certainly learned a lot and got experience, which also helped me to get the job which I have now, which is great.
All right, great. Thank you very much. And I see that Kai is online now. Very many apologies from my side, Kai. If the mistake came from my side, it's really a big pity that the time zone difference didn't allow you to attend this webinar. But at least during the last 1 or 2 minutes, I think you heard the last questions on recommendations for early career researchers on how to maybe help improve the science policy interface. Do you want to take the chance and give us at least one short answer on your perspective on this problem?
Yeah, thank you. And apologies to everybody. I should have checked again to make sure that the time was right. I think there are many routes through the science policy interface, and I think that people who are interested in this, I'd encourage them to try many of them and to see which ones work best for them. Javier mentioned The Honest Broker by Roger Pielke, and I've read that book, and I think it's very good. It's interesting that Dr. Pielke takes a very kind of issue advocate approach to his own, recommendations about where you should be on the science policy interface. And to be honest, I think, I don't think it's that simple. I think that there are times when actually it makes sense, for example, to play the role of the issue advocate. And what that means is, of course, that you compromise your ability to give an honest and unbiased representation of all the options, right? Because you are taking one side in the fight. But in some cases where you feel like there's no way that an honest representation of the options is going to appropriately bring attention to issues of concern, then that's an appropriate course to take. So. I've over the course of my career, I've played a number of different roles. In one case, with when our federal government was basically misrepresenting and suppressing science, I had to, over the issue of the Northern Gateway pipeline, I had to serve as a bit of an issue advocate in bringing an effort to bear with over 300 scientists who signed on to this letter. And it got a lot of media attention. But, I'll say that there are multiple different ways through. And the way that we took in that case was actually to try to still be honest brokers, in the sense of we didn't critique the pipeline. We only critiqued the use of science in the pipeline. And I think that's a very different way forward to be an issue advocate, right? We were issue advocates for the use of science, but not for the pipeline itself. That's more than a minute or two. I'd also just close in saying that, I completely agree with the call for internships. I've been helping to run an internship program at UBC for about 12 years. And I think it's, it's amazing to hear the stories from the students about how this enriched their careers and was the most important thing for them to be able to find a job that they found fulfilling afterwards. And so I'd highly encourage that. And I'd also mention that IPBES, or IPBES, as some people call it, has a fellows program that is a really great way to get into the science policy interface from that particular angle of the assessments.
Thanks a lot, Kai. Thanks for your contribution. And Xavier, yes, you would like to say?
1 minute, because I may otherwise have been misunderstood. I like what has been said by Kai. Just for me, when I say that it's very personal, this honest brokerage of policy options, at the same time, I fully recognize the danger if it's only made like this and nothing else is done. I fully agree with Kai. My view is that, again, it's very personal. I do not say you have to be one way or the other, but personally, I see a risk of science advocating directly, scientists advocating directly. Why? Because I remember when I was the director of the French Foundation for Research and Biodiversity, gathering, well, many academia, but also a range of stakeholders, policymakers, etc. Very quickly, it was striking that the non-academic actors here, one way or the other, they recognize a strength of science, which is more or less neutrality, which is very naive to say this, but still, as compared to others. It is in the board of FRB, most of stakeholders, they were here clearly with their own agenda, the agenda of their organization. It can be an NGO, business, whatever. Whereas normally scientists, they are trained, to present facts and to reason on facts, normally. And so I see a risk. At the same time, I see the risk of just saying things and nothing will happen. So personally, my view is that scientists should better use also boundary organizations. Boundary organizations, there are many, and I will not cite, but in doing this, you may have the vector, useful vector to make sure that the options you present or the results you present may be used, and even by organizations ready to advocate. They are shaped for this, they have the skills to do this, etc. I fear always when a single body is doing everything. And for science, I see a danger. This is the main point. So I share the view of Kai, just want to complete my own view.
Yeah, and I agree. There is a risk for sure. Sometimes the risk may seem to be worth it to take that approach of the issue advocate, but I agree that in general it will lead to the loss of perceived, the loss of credibility and the loss of perceived an unbiased stance. And that's really an important role that science has to play. And so we do compromise that a little bit when we advocate it directly.
Thanks a lot. That's a really interesting discussion. And unfortunately, in the 10 minutes that we're already over time, so I think we probably need to work on organizing a next webinar where we continue these discussion, these points and other questions. So for now, I'm afraid I will have to close, but thank you all very much. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to participants. And as I said, this was recorded, so we will put it on our website, and we will also circulate more detailed information on the next upcoming webinar, which will be on sustainable consumption and production. So I wish you all a good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it is for you. Thank you, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.